Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Underground Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Emery. I am also a YouTuber. I have been running my YouTube channel for about approximately 4 or 5 years now, off and on. I left YouTube for several years, and then I came back about a year and a half ago. And then a few months ago, I decided to dabble into podcasting. Where I also run a podcast called Internet Exposition, and you can check that out too if you want to. After starting that podcast up, I decided that I wanted to do some video game podcasts, and so my favorite series is Jak and Daxter. So before we get this podcast started, I thought I'd have a little fun and start with a trivia question to kind of get you a little bit intrigued. The trivia question I have today is, how many precursor orbs are there if you add all of them from the entire trilogy? That includes Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy, Jak 2, and Jak 3, just the first 3 games. How many precursor orbs are there over the process of the 3? And I'll give you the answer at the end of the podcast. I want you to try to see if you can figure out the answer without cheating. Try to think about all the individual games and how many precursor orbs they have, and see if you can add them together. Remember all the individuals so you can add them together. So try to think of the answer without cheating, and I'll give you the answer at the end of the podcast. So since this is the first podcast, I thought I'd give a little bit of backstory in the genesis of the very first game, that is being the Precursor Legacy. So the Precursor Legacy starts off with Jak and Daxter sneaking off to a place called Misty Island that their mentor, I guess you could call him, Samos, told them not to go. And so they head off to Misty Island. They kind of get themselves into trouble. Daxter accidentally falls into a pool of dark eco, and I'll have to explain the ecos a little bit later, but I'm just giving you a general overall discussion right now. We'll go in the nitty-gritty here in a little bit. But so Daxter falls into a pool of dark eco, and he changes from a human elf creature, whatever they're supposed to be. The Naughty Dog never really explains exactly what they're supposed to be. I guess it's just supposed to be some kind of fantasy element added to it, so they gave him big ears, kind of like an elf. And so he falls into the pool of dark eco, and he turns into this creature called an Otsil. Now, an Otsil is an otter and a weasel fused together. It's basically just a made-up creature. And I love the fact that the game begins to paint the picture or lay a foundation that before you even start playing the game, that dark eco is something you want to avoid. It's something bad. And throughout the game, you'll bump into dark eco, in various formats. Sometimes it's like a river type bottom thing that if you fall into it, you'll die in one automatically. And then there are times where you'll hit smaller doses of dark eco, where you'll hit like dark eco boxes or something like that. That'll do some significant, I can't speak today, amount of damage to you. And so I love the fact that right away in the game, it paints a picture that dark eco is something you want to avoid. It's something bad, And so after Daxter falls into the dark eco, Jak and Daxter head back to their mentor, I guess, Samos, and ask him for help to see if he can maybe change them back or figure out what they're supposed to do. Samos tells them that he cannot help them because he doesn't know much about dark eco. And so he tells them that he does know someone who does, though. Jak Acheron, the Sage. He is a sage over dark eco. The game seems to insinuate. But there's one problem. Jak Acheron does not have a warp gate turned on, and Samos also tells them that he could teleport them a little further along so they didn't have to venture so far, but he says the other sages do not have their teleport gates on either. So now he essentially tells them that they're going to have to, on foot, going to have to travel the entire way up to this person's house, to Gal's house, and he's not exactly living, next door. He's far to the north, and Samos insinuates that he lives far to the north, far to the north. And so that basically is how your adventure starts. So before you go head off into the village, though, which is where you first start off, is in Sandover Village, which I guess is where Jak and Daxter live. And Samo sends you to a place called Geyser Rock. And on Geyser Rock, you'll find your first 4 power cells and several, I believe it's 60 precursor orbs. I could be wrong about that number. Sometimes I get my numbers confused in different areas. And you also learn basically the basic mechanics of the game on Geyser Rock. But as soon as you get done with Geyser Rock, you'll start off in Sandover Village, where Jak and Daxter live. And you work your way through the village. Sandover Village is also connected to these 2 other areas called Sentinel Beach and the Forbidden Jungle. Now, Misty Island is accessible, if that's the right word, accessible, if you go talk to someone a fisherman who is in the Forbidden Jungle. If you go talk to him and help him out, then he'll let you use his speedboat, in order to take you over to Misty Island. So that's 3 places. If you can open up Misty Island, that gives you 3 whole places to explore once you get done with Geyser Rock. And the game slowly opens up like this. So the game in Sandover Village is kind of like your first, in these 3 connected places, is like your first area, if you will. And then the Sentinel Beach, Forbidden Jungle, and Misty Island are sort of like your mini areas that are all connected to, in some way or another, connected to Sandover Village. However, the cool thing about this game is that, in spite of the fact that there are certain areas to each other, these areas actually do not feel like levels at all. And that's exactly what Naughty Dog wanted to go to. They wanted to do with this game. They actually started the concept, the mindset of going in, before they even really had a story or characters in mind. They wanted to create a fully open world game with no loading screens. And they did exactly that. What originally was titled Project Y, because they didn't have a name for it yet, Naughty Dog decided to split into 2 different teams. The one team was finishing up with their Crash Bandicoot series with the Crash Bandicoot Crash Team Racing game, and then the other half of the team began to work on this new project known as Project Y. But what's different about now, there are a lot of open world games today. Back in those days, there weren't nearly as many. Most games usually had some sort of level selection in some way. Now, they were slowly becoming more and more open world. Mario 64 was an example of a game that was, for its time, was considered to be an open world game, but when it got down to it, it was still just a hub world with levels to select. Jak and Daxter, on the other hand, was a game that was fully 100% open world with different areas to walk to, instead of selecting them through some kind of level selection mechanism. But like I said, a lot of games today, though, however, are open world. But they're not quite open world in the same way that Jak and Daxter is. And I'm going to try my best to explain this. This is when I'm going to kind of get into the real meat and potatoes of this. And I'm going to, like I said, it's not easy to explain this concept, especially if you don't know a whole lot about level design or game mechanics. But even if you do, it's still not the easiest thing to explain. So, like I said, a lot of games today are open world, but they're a little bit different than the open world feel of Jak and Daxter. In Jak and Daxter, each spot and little area serves a point and purpose to them. There's not really a whole lot of empty space in Jak and Daxter. There's not going to be a whole lot of time, moments, and areas where you're just going to be walking with nothing to do in it. There's going to be each area and spot serve, for the most part, I would say about 85% of the game, serves a point and purpose to it. There's either going to be an enemy you're going to have to fight that's laid out for you, there's an item to collect, or there's something in some way to do with it, and to do in it, if I can speak correctly. And then there's the individual, what I don't know if there's a technical term for it, but I just kind of make up a phrase called, I call them bridge segments, where they really don't serve a point in purpose other than to connect one area to another area. Now, sometimes Naughty Dog would lay out precursor orbs, which is sort of like your coins of the game, currency, I guess you will, to give you something to collect while you're walking around. But it's like, what about when you're walking on your way back? You've already collected, most likely you've already collected all the orbs, so now you have nothing to do on your way back except just to walk to the next area. But this bridge point serves two purposes. Not the first purpose, Naughty Dog wanted to create these bridge points in order to let that new area load while you're walking through that point. They often disguise it with some like rocks or something to kind of hide the area as you're walking to the next part, so that way you don't see the screen loading. And they even added a little interesting aspect to it. If you've ever been playing Jak and Daxter and you randomly notice yourself just trip and fall for no reason, that's actually was carefully crafted into the game, because in case the area didn't load in time, which 90% of the time it did, but if in case it didn't, then your character would fall over, giving the area a few more seconds to load, so that way you wouldn't see a loading screen. The second purpose these bridge points serve is that I can't seem to get my words out correctly here as I'm doing this podcast for some reason. But yes, the second point these bridge points create is they also give you a feeling of more open worldness, bigger worlds. Because if you actually took out all the bridge points and took out all the little small empty spots and just crushed all the areas together, the game would actually not be that big. But through careful level design, Naughty Dog did a very good job making the world feel big and interactive and not feel like you're walking through levels. Instead, you're just walking from area to area. So these bridge points help you give a sense of more open worldness and more I just made up a new word and adventure and exploration, if you will. The game itself is actually very simple, though. Really, the entire point and purpose of the game is you to just collect power cells and move on to the next area. As you collect more power cells, you open more areas. When you collect 20 power cells, you get to leave the Sandover Village area and work your way over to the Blue Sage Hut area or Rock Village area with areas connected to it. And then you get 45 power cells, and then you get to go to the next area, and then so on and so on. I think the next one is like 72 or something like that. So the game itself is really not that complex, but everything built around it is so rich looking and so adventurous, and it feels so good, especially if it was a game you had never played a game like this before. But I would argue that this game is still very fun to play. Because I mentioned earlier that there are open world games today, but they're not quite the same as Jak and Daxter's version of open world. Because I mentioned before, most of the spaces in Jak and Daxter serve a point and purpose. You're always, for the most part, you're always doing something in some way. There's not a whole lot of moments where you're just walking around aimlessly, not really doing anything. Unfortunately, in a lot of open world games today, there are a lot of moments like that. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad game, it's just a different type of game. But I would argue, like, one game as an example maybe would be like Skyrim or some of the other RPG games that you could play that are really fun to play. Like I said, you're kind of comparing apples to oranges here, but they are really fun to play. And they are open world games. But they're not open world quite in the same way, because like I said, there are a lot of moments where you're just you feel like you're just walking around aimlessly, not really doing anything. There's lots of empty spaces. It almost feels like the developers just put in this huge open world, and then they just place little random spots, random buildings, random things in there to do. And I'm not saying they put it around randomly. Don't misquote me on that. I'm just saying that's how it feels sometimes in some moments. When I'm playing, like I remember the first time I played Oblivion, and when I was walking through the fields and stuff, like I had gotten out of the Imperial prison there, and I was walking through the fields, through the trees and stuff, and there was a lot of void feeling to it. There was a lot of empty space, a lot of void moments. Not really anything happened. It's like I was waiting on some kind of enemy to approach me, which sometimes it did and sometimes it didn't. And there was not a lot of structure and planned out moments. But like I said, Oblivion and Skyrim and lots of other RPGs like the Witcher series and stuff like that are very different types of games. But it feels sometimes, like I said, with those empty moments, can make things feel a little unsatisfying. With Jak and Daxter, on the other hand, when you're playing that game, everything feels like there's an order to it. There's a structure to it. It's kind of designed to cope you a certain way. But the good thing about this is, like I said, you never feel like you're wasting time or you're just walking around with nothing to do. You always feel like you have something else to do. Unfortunately, the downfall with this concept is after you play this game so many times, a lot of people can tend to get tired of a concept like this. It does have a lot of replayability, but once you play it multiple times, it can get a little tiresome after a while because there's not really too many other paths to take, too many other ways to do it. You know, you just kind of get in there and start collecting stuff and move on with your quest. But with a lot of RPGs and other open world games, there are lots of paths you can take. So each time you could play it literally like probably up to 100 times and still have a slightly different adventure. Excuse me, my throat is clogging up on me. You can have a slightly different adventure. But with Jak and Daxter, I like the concept that each area feels very different. That's another thing I wanted to kind of compare a little bit. A lot of open world games. I cannot seem to speak today. I feel like it's a little bit of a mistake or a down fall to it that a lot of RPGs make today is a lot of areas and stuff feel very similar to one another. There's only slight differences to them. But in Jak and Daxter, on the other hand, each area has a very different feeling. When you go over to like Sentinel Beach, and then you travel over to like Forbidden Jungle, or then work your way to Misty Island, each of these areas feel very different. And yet they still don't feel like levels. And it amazes me that Naughty Dog could pull something like that. Like I said, it takes very careful level design, very careful crafting. But like I said, with a lot of open world games today, they do feel similar sometimes. Like I said, you can travel to some places and you'll sit there and think, have I been here before? I feel like I've either been here or I've been in a place just like this. But Jak and Daxter, there's no question. Once you go to Forbidden Jungle, you know, I have not been here before. This is a new place for me. So you can know when you're exploring around and you're adventuring around that you're not going to make the mistake of repeating an area. Or have to check your map like 20 times. And like I said, I'm not downing those games. There's nothing wrong with game styles like that. And like I said, they're two very different styles. But I just wanted to express to people why I still can pick up Jak and Daxter today and play it and still have tons of fun with it, even though there are games that are technically bigger than that one now. Because they're bigger, but they're not quite stylized the same as Jak and Daxter. Jak and Daxter just does such a good job of letting you just adventure around with no map, and I mean there's a map but you don't need it, and just letting you adventure around and having fun. So like I said, there's pros and cons to both concepts, but even to this day I can still pick up Jak and Daxter and just have so much fun with it. Matter of fact, the first time I ever even played Jak and Daxter was when I think I was about 12 years old, 11 or 12 years old. It wasn't even my game. It wasn't even on my PS2. It was someone else's. And I played the game and immediately fell in love with it. I was just like, I think my jaw about hit the floor, literally, when I was playing it. And because I was just so amazed and mesmerized by this game. Because like I said, I had never played a fully open world game like this before. And I was just like, wow, But eventually, unfortunately, I had to give the PS2 back, and the game back. And but the cool thing is years later, when I think I was about 16 years old, my family finally got our first PS2. And my mom asked me what did I want for Christmas. I knew what video game I wanted to ask for. I still had it on my mind over all those years, and I was like, I want Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy. So, opened it up Christmas morning. I was so excited to see the game in there. And I think later on, I think as soon as we got done opening our presents, I immediately ran back there to the PS2 and popped it in and started playing. And just started having just as much fun as I had when I played the first time, if not more fun in some ways. Because the first time I played, I was not very too great at video games, and but then by the time I had hit 16, I had gotten much better. So I think it was, in some ways, it was more fun for me to play the game as a more mature gamer, I guess you could say. Now, my sister had actually played this game before me years prior. And while I was playing Jak and Daxter again, when I finally owned the game for myself, she mentioned to me that there was actually a sequel. I didn't even know there was a sequel. I thought it was just a standalone game. Because we didn't have internet at the time, and I didn't, there was really no way, if no one else knew about the video game series, or whatever it was, there was really no way of me knowing, like I said, with no internet access. But now, nowadays, a lot of people pretty much everybody has internet, and you can just, within 5 minutes, what's coming up and what's not coming and all that stuff. But back then, I didn't really know. So when she told me there was a sequel, I was shocked. And I was like, ooh, I gotta hurry up and finish this game so that way I can play the sequel. So when I got done playing this, the Precursor Legacy, I finally went to the game store, my local game store, and traded in some older games I had. Not Jak and Daxter, though, just some other older games. I still have Jak and Daxter even to this day. I love that game. And traded in some games, and I think paid the whatever fee it was, and got Jak 2. And I noticed on the cover that it looked very different in style. I saw Jak holding a gun. Daxter kind of had a more serious look on his face. Everything looked more dark and gritty, but I didn't think too much about it. Went home and popped it in, and man, oh man, was I surprised with some of the changes in the game. I was like, ooh, I didn't even know whether to feel like I liked him or didn't. I don't know. I just didn't know how to feel in that moment. I guess I was just surprised and didn't know what to think. So, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a later podcast. Some more details on Jak 2 and stuff like that. I wanted to kind of finish up with Jak and Daxter first. But that is it for today's podcast. But before we close that, I want to do a couple of things. First, I want to give a shout out. If you enjoy this podcast because you love Jak and Daxter, one interesting thing, before I started this podcast, I had noticed that I could only find one other podcast about Jak and Daxter that I could find. There may be others, but I could only find one. And so I'll give them a shout out. So if you like this podcast, or you just want to hear more podcasts about Jak and Daxter, there is another one called Jak. It's JAK''D. It's held by, I don't know all their names, but it's held by a group of people. They talk about Jak and Daxter. They kind of really break down each individual levels, talk about things they liked about it, things they didn't, and they also talk about theories and all kinds of stuff. Basically they talk about Jak and Daxter across the board, but they're working their way through the first game right now, and I'm assuming when they get done with that one, that they're going to move on to Jak 2. And they have mentioned Jak 2 some, but I think it seems like they're steering away from it a little bit because they want to go into deeper discussion on it later on. Like I said, they're really hitting with the first one. So if that sounds interesting to you, like I said, or you just want to hear more podcasts on Jak and Daxter, because evidently there's not enough of them out there, then definitely check them out. It's JAK''D, the podcast, Jak the podcast, or you can just probably type in Jak and Daxter on any podcast app, and it should pull it up. So, are you ready for the answer to the trivia question? Remember the question? The question was, how many precursor orbs were there across the entire Jak and Daxter trilogy? That includes Jak and Daxter, Precursor Legacy, Jak 2, and Jak 3. How many precursor orbs are there if you add them all together? Do you know what the answer is? Alright, so the Precursor Legacy has 2,000 precursor orbs in all, and Jak 2 has 286 orbs in all, and Jak 3 has 600 orbs in all. And so if you add them all together, you get 2,800 and what is that, 86 or 96? Yeah, 2,886. See, I don't even know the answer. I couldn't remember. I was sitting there thinking, wait, was there 286 or 296? I had to think for a second. So it's 2,886. Did you know the answer without having to look it up? I don't know. Let me know in the comment section below, or you can get a hold of me. If you want to get a hold of me, you can reach out to me on Instagram. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me because I'm on there all the time. My Instagram will be in the link in the description below. It's just Kevin W. Emery. Like I said, I'll put it in the link in below, the link in the description. Or you can reach out to me through message. I think there should be a link in my description. If you click on it, it'll allow you to send a voice message to me through my podcast hosting app. And you can tell me, if you want to talk about something about Jak and Daxter, or if you want to tell me if you knew the answer or not, or whatever. Anything you want to tell me about Jak and Daxter related commentary, or what you think about, my podcast in general. Also, if you want to check out, if you liked the way I did this podcast, if you want to check out another podcast that I do, it's called Internet Exposition. I'll put a link in the description for that one as well. Now, I will warn you, though, this one, Internet Exposition, is stylized a little differently than this podcast. This podcast is a little bit more traditional style podcast, where I kind of just present or have it's more conversational or presentable, where I'm talking about, like I said, a video game series, Jak and Daxter. So, but with Internet Exposition, that podcast, I'll talk a lot about internet culture, things about the internet. I talk about YouTube mostly, but I also talk about Twitch and TikTok and Instagram, and I just various things about the internet culture. And that one's stylized a little different. It's stylized a little bit more like a radio talk show, because I have separate segments on there that I because it's a podcast, but it's supposed to kind of feel like a radio talk show. And so that's why it's stylized that way. So like I said, I'll give you a heads up when you listen to it. Don't expect it to be kind of just like this one. And also, if you want to check out my YouTube channel, the link will be in the description for that one as well. If you're interested, my YouTube, I do challenges, your standard YouTube stuff. I do challenges, and sometimes I'll throw in some skit videos and stuff like that. And so if you are interested in that, you can check that out. And I think that's it for today's episode. Yeah, I think so. So let me know what you thought. This is the very first episode, so probably not too great, but hopefully it'll get better. But I am Kevin Emery, and I'm out.